This presentation is brought to you by the KathleenWellsShow.com.
Upcoming retired CIA analyst, Ray McGovern. Hi, this is Kathleen Wells with the Progressive Voices Network. Earlier, I interviewed retired CIA analyst Ray McGovern. Initially, I was going to talk to Ray about Obama's speech and the launching of a new American war in the Middle East. But after reading Ray's interview with Berliner magazine, I knew we had to discuss Ukraine. In that interview with Berliner, Ray talked about Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland's role in fixing the intelligence. In that interview, Ray explicitly stated that the intelligence on Ukraine was fixed. In fact, he wrote an open letter to the Chancellor of Germany, Angela Merkel, where he drew a direct analogy between the deception of the public to justify the war in Iraq with what's going on now in Ukraine. McGovern founded Veterans Professionals for Sanity in 2003, and he was motivated to start this organization due to the lies being told regarding the presence of weapons of mass destruction being present in Iraq. Ray has stated that the U.S. political and diplomatic position have been eroded beyond repair, and that the United States has, throughout the world, lost credibility. He also feels that the United States public has been malnourished on truth. Hey, for some nourishment, take a listen to my interview with retired CIA analyst Ray McGovern. Hi, welcome. This is the Kathleen Wells Show. I'm your host, Kathleen, and today we're going to talk about Ukraine with my guest, Ray McGovern. Let me tell you a little bit about him before I bring him on. Ray McGovern is a retired CIA officer who holds a master's in Russian studies from Fordham University, a certificate in theological studies from Georgetown, and is a graduate of Harvard Business School Advanced Management Program. He served as a CIA analyst from 1963 to 1990, and in the 80s he chaired the National Intelligence Estimates and prepared the President's Daily Brief. He also received a Commendation Medal at his retirement. In 2003, he founded Veterans Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, and he is frequently called upon to comment on intelligence issues that challenge our collective sanity. In fact, Mr. McGovern spent all of last month, all of September, giving talks throughout Europe, in Glasgow, London, Berlin, and Moscow, and also in Northern California. Welcome, Ray McGovern, to the Kathleen Wells Show.
Kathleen. Thank you very much, Kathleen.
I'm delighted to have you. Well, on the second day of the NATO summit, which was on September 5th, you conducted an interview in Berlin with Berliner magazine. And in that interview titled Ukraine, Russia was always elected to be the enemy, you stated that the intelligence was fixed. In fact, you wrote an open letter to Angela Merkel challenging the notion that Russia is fighting alongside and arming insurgents opposing the legitimate government in Kyiv. So elaborate on the letter you sent to Angela Merkel, and also elaborate on this notion that the intelligence that we've been getting was fixed intelligence.
Sure. Be happy to do that. The term fixed actually was used back before Iraq. Very briefly, when the British decided that they would follow our lead and attack Iraq, they needed an excuse, and they sent their top intelligence official to Washington to talk to the then head of the CIA. His name was George Tenet. And so on the 20th of July, 2002, Richard Dearlove, who was the head of MI6, the British equivalent of CIA, quizzed Tenet, who, of course, saw the president several mornings a week, and said, "What's going on?" Well, he was told by Tenet, and when he came back and briefed Tony Blair, the British Prime Minister, together with 10 of his aides, 3 days later, we're talking July 23, 2002, what Sir Richard Dearlove said was, and I quote, Bush has decided to make war on Iraq for regime change. The war will be justified by the conjunction of terrorism and weapons of mass destruction. A translation would be, we're going to say that Saddam Hussein has all manner of weapons of mass destruction, and he's likely to give them to terrorists. And then the last sentence of that first paragraph read as follows: the intelligence and facts are being fixed around policy. That, end quote. So the fixed was, never before have I seen an official document, and this was the official minutes of that meeting on the 23rd of July, 2002. Never have I seen this kind of evidence, written evidence. No one challenges its authenticity, but here's written evidence that Tony Blair, George Bush, George Tenet, the head of the CIA, and Richard Dearlove and all the other Brits, all the other British around that table were told, yeah, there's going to be a war, and it'll be justified by saying Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction and that he's likely to give them to terrorists. And when Jack Straw, the British Foreign Secretary at the time, said, well, yeah, but there's no real good evidence that they have weapons of mass destruction, still less would they be likely to give whatever they had to terrorists, that's when that last sentence came in. But the intelligence and facts are being fixed around the policy. So we all know the sad story about the weapons of mass destruction that were said to exist before we attacked Iraq, and then all of a sudden didn't exist. And we know for sure that there were no operational ties between Baghdad, Iraq, and al-Qaeda. So this was a rather monstrous thing. And when George Bush and Dick Cheney said, oh, it was really a terrible mistake, our great regret was that the intelligence was mistaken on Iraq. Well, that's yet another lie. It was not mistaken. It was fraudulent. And you don't have to take my word for that. Just if you look at what the chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee said right after a 5-year investigation about the pre-war intelligence on Iraq. And what he said, his name was Rockefeller, he was chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee, he said the evidence used to justify the war in Iraq was, quote, unsubstantiated, contradicted, or even non-existent, period, end quote. Now, I ask your listeners to think about what non-existent intelligence looks like. It was fraud through and through. Now, that's only 12 years ago, right? And so here we see Iraq part 2 here, when we see adduced to explain that, number one, pro-Russian separatists shot down an airliner, and number two, that the Russians had invaded southeastern Ukraine, and the evidence adduced was an embarrassment to any professional intelligence officer. If that's all they had, these very fuzzy photographs, then it was a hoax similar to the fixed intelligence before Iraq. And we thought that Angela Merkel, who's the chancellor of Germany, that she ought to know that last time she was wrong. Last time she supported the war in Iraq, but luckily she wasn't chancellor. Gerhard Schröder was chancellor then, and he came under all kinds of criticism because for the first time since World War II, the Germans said, no, we're not going to do what the U.S. says we should do. We're not going to count us out. We're not going to be part of the coalition. Put us in the coalition of the unwilling, if you will. We're not going to start a war of aggression because we know what that is. So we said to Angela Merkel, you really ought to kick the tires, so to speak. You really ought to check all this bogus intelligence that is being adduced to explain those two things. And if you have doubts, as we do, and no doubt your intelligence service does, if they're being honest, then you might want to guide yourself accordingly before you give arms to the Ukrainian government or before you do other things that you will later regret.
And in
So
fact,
that's why we sent this letter to her.
right, and in fact, in your letter to Merkel, you made the direct analogy between the deception of the public to justify the war in Iraq with what's going on now in Ukraine. And when you say fix, you're talking about something that is intentional as opposed to negligent. Am I right?
That's correct. Yeah, there was one sort of funny note, if it weren't so serious. Fox News immediately fixed on the word fixed. And they said, oh, now please don't be deceived here. Fix, the usage of the word fix has a completely different connotation in British usage. So I called my friend Harry in London. I said, Harry, you got a second here? Tell me, what does fix mean? He said, have you lost it? I said, no. In British usage, you use the word fix. What does it mean? He says, well, you fix a horse race, you fix an election. What's the matter with you? Thank you very much, Harry. Fix means fix. And, the evidence on the fixed evidence later will prove chapter and verse, as I quoted the chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee admitting.
So the question is why? Why would the U.S. want to fix the intelligence? Why would the U.S. want to start a new Cold War with Russia?
Well, it's twofold in my view. And you have to really go back to put a historical perspective here. When the Berlin Wall fell, that was 25 years ago. It was November 9-10, 1989. There was an incredibly rare, I'd say unique in my lifetime, opportunity for peace throughout Europe. And that was a function of enlightened statesmen, George H.W. Bush, the first George Bush, and Mikhail Gorbachev, and his Secretary of State, Shevardnadze. What Bush did, and it's much to his credit, he immediately called up Gorbachev and said, Mikhail, we're really sorry for your trouble there in Berlin, but this could be very volatile. We need to get together right away to see if we can make a wonderful chance for peace on this. And they met 3 weeks later in Malta, and they issued a joint declaration saying this is a unique chance for peace in Europe from Portugal to the Ural Mountains. And we're going to do all we can to make sure that happens. George Bush told Gorbachev, and this came out publicly, I, George Bush, am not going to dance on the Berlin Wall, meaning I'm not going to take advantage of your problems there in Eastern Europe. So Bush sent his Secretary of State, James Baker, to Moscow 2 months later, first week of February. We're talking 1990 now. And I have this from the U.S. Ambassador, Jack Matlock, who was there. He was there in Malta at the summit, and then he was there when Baker came to Moscow. He was the U.S. Ambassador. And what Jack tells me is this. Baker said, look, we're worried. You've got 24 divisions, 24 highly expert and mechanized divisions, army divisions, of course, in east part of Germany. We're worried that you might be tempted to use them as you used your forces to suppress the Hungarian Revolution in '56, the Czech Spring in '98 and in '68. And so we're worried about that. Now, we want to have Germany into a united Germany, and we want to make it part of NATO. Now, Kathleen, if you know, and I'm sure you do, if your listeners know anything about Russian history, the indignities and invasions and so forth that Russia suffered from troops from Napoleon to Hitler coming through Ukraine and into the middle of Russia, you'll know what a tough pill that was for Gorbachev and Shevardnadze to swallow. And so they say, well, that's a big deal. What's the quo here? You want a big quid. What's the big pro quo? And so Baker said, how would it be if we didn't move NATO 1 inch farther east toward Russia? And Gorbachev said, well, let me think about that. Came back the next day and said, you got a deal. We'll pull our troops out of Eastern Germany. will allow a reunified Germany so long as it remains in NATO and Germany is not able to develop its own nuclear deterrent. And in return, you promise not to move NATO 1 inch farther east. That was the promise. Everyone agrees. The German Foreign Ministry has documents that indicate that their foreign minister at the time, Genscher, had the same conversation with Shevardnadze. It was not written down. And so when Bill Clinton became president, and the Czech Republic and Poland and Hungary decided, well, maybe they'd like to be in NATO, and he saw a really good opportunity to appear tough on defense and also get the votes of many of those East European emigres in key states. He said, well, let's make them part of NATO. And his advisors would have had to say, well, that's a nice idea, Mr. President, but we promised the Russians we wouldn't do that. And, Clinton's a lawyer, so he said, well, show me the paper. Well, there was no paper. Okay. Now, curiously enough, and this is kind of new, I had a chance to raise this with one of Gorbachev's chief aides from 1989 to 1991 in Moscow 3 weeks ago. And I said, can you throw some light on why it was never written down, why this agreement was, it's really bizarre that you have a piece of paper on it. And what he said was this. He said, the Soviet Union was falling apart. There were all kinds of people trying to do a revolution to get rid of me and Gorbachev, says Shevardnadze. We were so distracted, and it seemed like we made a deal, a gentleman's deal, and I guess the bottom line is we trusted you. Now, 6 years later, how many new countries in NATO? 12. All east of Germany. How many original NATO countries? 12. So they doubled in size. And then 6 years ago, 2008, NATO, in its wisdom, decided that they would enfold Ukraine and Georgia also into NATO, came out with a summit statement, a declaration saying, and I quote, Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO, end quote. So this is not only disregarding earlier promises, but the Russians had warned us that this would not be allowed, that this was the cable from Moscow that conveyed this warning was titled Niet means Niet, Russia's red line on NATO expansion. And the red line, of course, was Georgia and Ukraine. And every time the Russians mention this, they also say, we asked the United States why they would want to do this. The Warsaw Pact alliance, the one that we ran in Eastern Europe, that dissolved in 1991. So why would NATO still want to exist? And why still would it want to expand? So that's the history of all this. And getting up to the present time, this all came into bas relief when late last year NATO made a proposal to the Ukrainian President Yanukovych to bail him out economically. And it looked like a good deal to him at first blush, and then he read the fine print. And the fine print indicated that Ukraine would have to do all the kinds of things that Greece and other less developed countries need to do. Austerity, they call it. But what it is an immense sacrifice on the part of the people of Ukraine. And just at that time, at the turn of the year, Putin offered Yanukovych a much better deal, including $15 billion right off the top. And so Yanukovych said, well, I'm going to take the Russian deal. And that's when all hell broke loose. People in the western Ukraine, seriously, many of them do want to become part of Western Europe in a more integrated way. But there was also a lot of stoking of the flames. I dare say some of this stoking was led by proto-fascists, which are not new to the Ukraine, as people who know any history know. And they led the charge in February for a coup d'etat. Now, this is the most unusual coup d'etat that I have ever seen or read about, and I've been in Washington 51 years.
Well,
what makes it interesting...
Ray, we're going to take a break right now. I have to take a break right now,
Sure.
But when we come back from the break, we're going to talk about this coup d'etat that was led and provoked by, you say in the interview with ex-Berliner magazine, was provoked by the U.S., NATO, and also the pro-fascists.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to talk about this coup d'etat when we come back from the break. We're talking with former retired CIA officer Ray McGovern. We'll be right back.
I'm David Pakman, host of The David Pakman Show on the Progressive Voices channel on TuneIn. Check out my show at davidpakman.com. That's David, Pakman.com. Actress Emma Watson, on September 21st, who is also a United Nations Goodwill Ambassador, stood up at the United Nations headquarters in New York City and gave a speech that condemned the harm that gender discrimination causes for both men and women, and invited men to become more active participants in the global struggle for equality. The next day, anonymous individuals set up a website supposedly targeting Emma Watson with sexual threats and a countdown meant to be believed to be a countdown to when nude pictures supposedly stolen from Emma Watson would be released. Initially, some users on the 4chan message board took credit for creating the website, which features the 4chan logo. We have now found out, Lewis, that as of right now, as of just before we went to broadcast today, it appears that it is not 4chan that is responsible for this website and these threats, but rather a marketing stunt by a company called Rantic, who has as a goal that they are working on shutting down 4chan altogether. So it appears, Lewis, that a very serious situation here, which is Emma Watson making a logical, a well-reasoned speech, a speech that has actually inflamed many so-called men's rights activists when she was not advocating for women's rights over men's rights. She was not advocating pro-feminist so-called militant propaganda, the term we hear from these men's rights groups at all, but simply saying we need men engaged in the battle for gender equality and eliminating gender discrimination. This is very serious stuff, and the backlash is a very serious and real thing. And a viral marketing group that has the goal of eliminating 4chan takes this as an opportunity to throw Emma Watson in. I find this to be pretty distasteful.
Of course, but it's just business as usual, isn't it? This is, it's clever, I guess, in a way, capitalizing on those recent events, but business as usual. Yeah, more or less. And in spite of the fact, I want to make clear, in spite of the fact that the threats were not coming from 4chan, but rather from this viral marketing group, Rantic, the response from many so-called men's rights activists was very positive to this, saying we should be releasing nude pictures of Emma Watson because she's speaking out, preaching this pro-feminist nonsense, and she deserves to be punished, which is amazing because the fact that that was the response from many individuals actually proves that we need people like Emma Watson and others taking this issue of gender discrimination seriously. In other words, we have someone who speaks out about issues of gender discrimination, and all of a sudden people are talking about her individual sexual history and cheering for the potential release of nude pictures which were in this imaginary world created by Rantic, stolen from her illegally. It actually proves that this is a serious issue. It is a serious issue, and for people like Emma Watson, this must be one of the most infuriating and aggravating battles to have to try and fight. You've been listening to part of the David Pakman Show on the Progressive Voices channel on TuneIn. For full audio and video podcasts, interviews, and much more, check out our website, davidpakman.com. That's David, Pakman.com. And check out our YouTube channel at youtube.com/The David Pakman Show.
This presentation is brought to you by the Kathleen Wells Show.com.
Hi, welcome back. This is Kathleen Wells, The Kathleen Wells Show. My guest is Ray McGovern, former CIA analyst who served as a CIA analyst from 1963 to 1990. And in the 80s, he chaired the National Intelligence Estimates and prepared the president's daily brief. So, Mr. McGovern, we were just talking about the fact that a coup d'etat occurred in Ukraine, that pro-fascists...
Correct. Mm-hmm. Yeah. What happened was after Yanukovych decided to go with the Russian bailout rather than the EU, the European Union bailout, there were a lot of people that wanted to get rid of Yanukovych for lots of reasons. What happened was we had an intercepted conversation between the Assistant Secretary of State, Victoria Nuland, our Assistant Secretary of State, of course, and the U.S. Ambassador in Kiev, the capital of Ukraine. His name is Jeffrey Pyatt. And that conversation went like this. Nuland, Jeff, Yats is our guy. Those other guys can wait in the wings, but I don't think it's a good idea to have Klitschko or anybody else in there. Yats is our guy. He has run the central bank, and he knows what austerity means, and he's willing to implement the austerity measures, and he's Yats is our guy, okay? Now, other things she said I can't pronounce on this radio, but on this radio program, because when the ambassador, our ambassador, said, well, what about the EU? She said the F word with respect to the EU, and curiously, the Western media only dwelled on the F word. They didn't dwell on the fact that here was an open conversation between the Assistant Secretary of State and the U.S. Ambassador plotting a coup. Now, that conversation, I don't know who intercepted it, probably Russian Secret Service, but it went up on YouTube at the end of January, okay? So I'm thinking, wow, this is pretty... Well, it defies all security regulations to be talking on an open phone about this, especially when you're plotting a coup. But there it is, Yats. The fellow's name was Yatsenyuk. Okay?
But you know what?
What happened?
But, Ray, you know what? I still haven't figured out why does it benefit the U.S. to plot a coup in Ukraine? What is the benefit to the United States to do that?
Well, that's a really good question. Two things here. There's this overweening desire to make sure that Russia does not become a military threat in any sense in the distant future. It is no military threat now, except the overall deterrent posture that it has by virtue of its strategic arms. But the whole philosophy, going back to actually Bill Clinton and then George H.W. Bush, was to make sure that since we were the sole remaining superpower in the world, no one would be allowed to develop the kind of military or strategic threat that would endanger any of our goals. And so Russia has to be kept in its place, and the best way to do that is to extend NATO right to Russia's borders and finally to the Ukraine. Now, the Ukraine was a particularly sensitive spot, because it's always been known as the soft underbelly of Russia. Catherine the Great extended Russian rule down there at the end of the 18th century, at the same time we were having a revolution here in this country. And the prize there was the warm water port for the Russian Navy. That's the only warm water port they have, okay? That's the only place they can sail out when the ice closes in Leningrad and the others, okay? So that is a strategic asset that the Russian Navy, of course, needs to keep. And when we threatened the Ukraine, and when all hell broke loose on the square of Kiev, and the coup d'etat took place, spearheaded by Svoboda and the right sector, widely acknowledged to be proto-fascist forces, Putin, the head of Russia, was looking on here. And what does he see? The day after, some influential legislators, the ones that came in after this unconstitutional coup, and nobody says the coup was constitutional. In a democracy, if you want to replace the government, you usually wait for the next election, which was just a year away. You don't have a coup. Now, the coup took place. The U.S. immediately recognized the new government, and the new legislators started saying, well, let's ban Russian as a national language, an official language, and, let's kick the Russians out of Crimea. Well, that's a little bit too much for the Russians, and they reacted to that in a way that was utterly predictable, and that is that they saw Crimea in danger, where they have their naval base at Sevastopol there in Crimea, and they saw NATO trying to have designs on that. The EU agreement that had been broached in December had provisions in it for common defense and all that kind of thing. And besides all that, Putin and his people knew that most of the people in Crimea had no love lost between them and Kiev, and especially the coup regime, that most of them were of Russian stock. And so there was a referendum there arranged, and the Crimeans voted something like 95% to rejoin Russia. Now, when I say rejoin Russia, that's another important facet here, because Ukraine used to be part of the Soviet Union, right? Well, how did it become an independent sort of thing? Well, Khrushchev, the Soviet leader, who replaced Stalin way back in 1953, 1954, took it into his head to say, well, Ukraine and Crimea, they're always going to be part of the Soviet Union, but I could win some political support from Ukraine if I take Crimea and take it off the Russian Republic and give it to the Ukrainians. And so he did a piece of paper, no plebiscite, no referendum, and he made Crimea part of the Ukraine. Now, did that matter? No, it didn't matter in 1954 because no one anticipated the breakup of the Soviet Union. Did it matter after the coup this year, February 22, 2014? It mattered a great deal. So the Crimeans voted for independence or voted to rejoin Russia. And then Putin had a tough decision to make. Would he accept that? He consulted with his various organs there, and they decided yes, they would. Now, how much bloodshed took place there? How many people were killed? 0. It was the most remarkable assimilation or reassimilation of a land here back into the mother country that I've ever seen in my professional career. So, why do I say all that? Well, because Crimea is incredibly important. The more so, and Putin has said this, although you don't see this in the Western press, Putin has said, look, when we decided to accept the Crimea back into Russia, we were guided by two things. The notion that Ukraine was still leaning, or that NATO wanted Ukraine to become a member of NATO, and if that happened, our naval base would be lost to us. And he's sometimes very jocular in the way he phrases it. He says, I'm sure that U.S. sailors and NATO sailors, I'm sure they're terrific fellows. But I'd much rather not have to visit them in their naval base in Sevastopol, Crimea. I'd really much rather have it the way it is now, where they're free to visit us in our naval base in Sevastopol. Now, why is this all important? Well, the U.S. is trying to set up a missile defense system that they say is against Iranian or even North Korean missiles, but nobody who knows anything about geography or strategy, nobody doubts that it's designed to be used against Russia. And the Russians, of course, know that. And what Robert Gates did as defense secretary, when he saw that the Poles and the Czechs and the Czech Republic, that they really didn't want to host these missiles because that would make them targets of the Russian strike, they decided, well, we'll put them on ships. Now, where would they put those ships? I'll put them in the Black Sea. How would they get there? Well, the Treaty of Montreux guarantees access for all countries. And so what Putin said was that membership in NATO we wanted to prevent, but even more important was the anti-missile defense system that's now going to be put on ships. And we didn't want to face the prospect of this kind of system being introduced and the West, namely the U.S., getting the idea that they could strike our missile deterrent in what is called in the trade a first strike, which means a strike so powerful and all-encompassing that there's no retaliatory strike possible. Now, that is, as you can see, a very volatile situation. If the Russians think that our Navy and our armed forces think that they can target from the Black Sea and other naval installations not only their medium-sized ballistic missiles and airfield, but also their ICBMs, their intercontinental ballistic missiles, well, then there's the danger of that first strike where no retaliation is possible, and there is the disappearance of deterrence, which has really kept the peace for these last couple of decades. Nobody likes the thought of, mutually assured destruction, but as long as no country fears that the other country thinks it can destroy its entire deterrent, there's a balance there. And I happen to be in Moscow in 1972 when the anti-ballistic missile treaty was signed, and that was an incredible force for stability, a balance of terror, if you like, but at least a balance. So what Putin is saying now is, look, this is very destabilizing. And indeed, he's right, because if the Russians fear that the U.S. gets this national missile defense thing where it could permit a first strike, then what happens? Well, then at the very first sign that this may be coming, what do the Russians do? They launch on warning, okay? That's another trade term, but it means as soon as you think the other side is going to destroy your missiles and your airfields, you launch at that first sense of warning, and what happens? We all get fried, as we almost did during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So this is very, very serious stuff.
So, Ray, this is all about a geostrategic position. It's like a game, a plan. And also you mentioned about the omissions made by the U.S. media, by the Western media. We're going to talk about the media's role in all of this geopolitical gamesmanship when we come back from the break. We're going to take a break. We're talking with Ray McGovern, who is a former CIA analyst, and we'll be right back.
You're not going to go there, are you?
Oh, yes, I am.
Hey, it's Carell, and you can go there with me each and every weekend here on the Progressive Voices Network, heard at progressivevoices.com or in the TuneIn app. And, of course, at my website, I am Carell, and my app, the Carell Cast. Now, here's a little sample of what you'll be getting. All right, Chris Breen, senior editor at Macworld.com, is here to talk to us about the fact that, watch it wiggle, it appears if you make a phone out of metal and you make it thin and people put pressure on it, well, what do you know? It'll bend.
Yeah, so this is the big thing now. That
10 million bendable buddies.
10 million bendable buddies. Somebody took their iPhone 6 Plus, and they had it in a tuxedo pocket, and they sat on the thing for about 18 hours through the course of a wedding and all the stuff that goes with it, and they found that it bent. Not a big surprise. It's made out of metal instead of plastic.
And your butt's hot.
It is long, it's thin, and that's going to be what happens.
I had one bend on me. I did. I'm a motorcyclist, as you know, and so our jackets fit very snugly. I mean, they're very snug, and they're form fitting. So they have a pocket right here, and I put my iPhone 5 in it, and it laid up flat against me, and I went to San Francisco. And when I got to San Francisco 9 hours later, the iPhone was warped. It's not just a 6 problem. They do this, but you're right. They're metal. Metal bends.
Yeah, and part of the problem is, obviously, it's a design issue that if that's what people want and they don't want kind of a cheap-looking plastic thing, that this is an issue. So they're really going to have to, unfortunately, and I hate to invoke sort of you're holding it wrong, but you're putting it in your pocket wrong. You're going to have to put it somewhere else.
Right. It's no longer the most convenient to carry it in your pocket. So tune in every weekend here at ProgressiveVoices.com or in the TuneIn app or in my app, the Carell-Cast, and at my website, IamCarell.com.
This is Tara Devlin, a.k.a. Pterodactyl from RepublicanDirtyTricks.com on the Progressive Voices channel on TuneIn. And this is my 2-minute tirade, sponsored by Credo Mobile. Let's just lay it on the line. The only reason a conservative gets out of bed in the morning is to undermine every Enlightenment principle that gave birth to this nation. Today, like in every point in human progress, where there is an empowered working class, there are conservatives whining about socialism. Where there is compassion, there are conservatives crying about takers. Where there is respect, there are conservatives whining about political correctness. And where there are free and fair elections, there are conservatives trying to rig the vote in their favor. So, naturally, where there are campaign finance laws meant to tamp down on the influence of money in politics, there are right-wing judges overturning democracy safeguards. This is where we stand with Citizens United, the right-wing activist Supreme Court ruling that started unleashing unlimited bribes into the political system. You see, conservatives want corrupted elections. They loathe democracy and can't stand when we, the people, have the power to participate in self-governance because we might get in the way of their mission to hand our nation back over to the entrenched intergenerational aristocracy, the likes of which our founders fought a revolution against. You know, like real patriots would do. Conservatives aren't comfortable with one person, one vote because they lose and would much rather have $1, one vote. And they're doing it. After all, they have teabaggers convinced that indentured servitude to transnational corporations equals freedom. The remedy for this is congressional action. Go to credoaction.com to sign the petition to tell Congress to advance a constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United. That's credoaction.com. Go there now. We stick together, we win. This is Pterodactyl from RepublicanDirtyTricks.com. Keep listening for 2-minute tirades and more on the Progressive Voices channel on TuneIn.
This presentation is brought to you by the KathleenWellsShow.com.
Welcome back. This is Kathleen with the Kathleen Wells Show on KCAA, the station that leaves no listener behind. We're speaking with Ray McGovern, retired CIA analyst. So, Ray, let me ask you a question. You were stating that it was geostrategically to the advantageous to the United States to provoke disruption, chaos, a civil war in the Ukraine. Am I stating it correctly?
Well, yeah, I would just distinguish between who thinks that's a good idea, and they are the so-called neocons, the neoconservatives who seem to be running the foreign policy for not only George Bush, but now for Barack Obama. I don't think it's a good idea. The Russians certainly don't. And I think Europe is coming around to see that this is not a good idea, except, and this is important, except for the arms manufacturers, the arms dealers, the arms sellers. They come out smelling like a rose, Kathleen. And when somebody asks, cui bono, who profits from all this? Well, it's not only who profits, it's who profiteers on all this. And it is the defense industries. It is the so-called military-industrial complex that President Eisenhower warned about as he left office in his farewell address. I was just looking at the contributions being given to Buck McKean, the chair of the House, I guess it's the House Armed Services Committee. And here are the top contributors: Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, General Atomics, General Dynamics, Boeing, Defense Aerospace, Defense Electronics. So you're getting millions and millions, and most of these people are close to $1 million. These are the people in Congress who are appropriating the money for these same industries and these same corporations to come back and give a slice of that money to their campaigns. It's a wonderful, wonderful circular sort of thing. And what you have is not only what Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex, but it's what he wanted to call and is now the military-industrial congressional complex. Congress appropriates the money. The arms dealers make the weapons. They sell the weapons to whomever. And the thing you have to remember here is you need an enemy. I mean, one of the real downers for the European defense industry was they had this common NATO battle tank, okay? And they were developing it, and all of a sudden, Russia imploded. There was no threat from the Soviet Union. And so this conglomerate of very big German and French defense corporations was sort of dead in the water. Until when? Until Russia was accused of invading Ukraine on the basis of very, very flimsy evidence. What happened? Their stock zoomed up, and they said, now finally we're going to get our common European battle tank. That's a microcosm example of what goes on here. And the thing I would add is that the same corporations that profiteer on these wars control our media.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to get to.
Thing.
Yeah, that's what I want. In fact, in your interview, you termed it the Military Industrial Congressional Media Security Services Complex. So, yeah, I want to touch on this fact that the media has been complicit in this duplicity to in this fraud to confuse and betray the American people. Touch on the media's role and how the media has failed.
Sure. Well, let me pick up on the media and the Ukraine, just to kind of continue that discussion, and then we talk about the media and Middle East. Today, I have in front of me the Washington Post, and it's quite remarkable because not only in their editorial policy, but in their reportage, they have a distinctly anti-Russian, pro-Israeli bent on everything they write. Now, here's a piece on China and the riots that are happening in Hong Kong. And sort of incidentally, they talk about the head of China being concerned, especially after the overthrow of Viktor Yanukovych, the duly elected Ukrainian president, following, and here I quote, following months of street demonstrations in Kiev that were viewed here in Beijing as explicitly backed by the West, end quote. Well, hello. They were backed by the West. That telephone conversation that I indicated to you, pick the new prime minister, Yanukovych, not Yanukovych, but Yatsenyuk. So it's not as though they were explicitly, they were viewed here in China as backed by the West. They were mounted by the West. There was a coup d'etat mounted by the security services, very Western folks, and the proto-fascists. So that's how far they go. Even on an article ostensibly about China, they say, well, it was backed by the West. The West immediately recognized the Putsch government, which was unconstitutional. And so this is the media here. And the media is giving the idea that Russia is behind all this. Putin bad. Putin sometimes has no shirt on. Putin rides horse with no shirt on. Putin invades Ukraine. Putin very bad. Putin shoots down civilian airliners. All this stuff is the worst kind of yellow journalism that I have not seen since 12 years ago when Bush and Cheney wanted to justify a war on Iraq.
But what happened to the idea? Wait, what happened to the idea of a free press? Mm-hmm. What happened to that? The media being the fourth, journalism being the fourth estate. What happened to that notion?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's gone by the board. The bad news to tell you is that the fourth estate is dead. Whether it's because of self-censorship, whether it's because you're afraid you'll be put in jail, as James Risen, Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter for the New York Times, is being threatened because you won't reveal one of his sources, or whether it's because you just like the money. 6 figures come easy. All you have to do is hew to the line. You could see it every Sunday on the talk show. Do I get on the talk show? No. Do any of my friends? Of course not. I get on CNN maybe every year or so until they remember the kinds of things I might say, and then they keep me off. So it's the corporations that run the coverage, and they also are explicitly involved in the war. So since Watergate, the media has gone down into the point where now you can't get straight news from TV news, certainly, and from very few newspapers. Now, what's the good news? The good news is that there's a fifth estate, and the fifth estate, of course, is in the ether. As I go around talking colleges and universities, it dawns on me, none of these young people read the newspaper. None of them, think they're getting news from TV. And that's a good thing because they know where to seek out news. They know where to go on the Internet and on the web. And so there's the fifth estate. That is our hope. That is the promise. And as more and more people find out what websites to look at, they can become better educated than they were even during the heyday of Watergate.
Well, tell listeners where, to the Kathleen Wells Show, where they can find your interviews, your information, so that they can seek it out, so they can find it.
Sure.
Where can they go?
Sure. Well, my son in L.A. Set up a website for me, and that's raymcgovern.com. And he posts links to all the things that I write and most of the things that I interview with and my speeches. But then the most authoritative and the best investigative journalism site is the one that I write for in the first instance. It's called consortiumnews.com, CONSORTIUM news, all one word, .com. That's run by Robert Perry. He was the journalist that won all kinds of awards for revealing Iran-Contra, to include Ollie North's role in that. And when it became no longer possible for him to publish the truth, whether at Newsweek or AP or Frontline, he quit. He's one of the few people who just quit the Fourth Estate and has his own website. Again, it's consortiumnews.com. What I also highly recommend is Amy Goodman's program, which is called democracynow.org. I start my day watching Amy Goodman, and chances are very, very high that I'll learn from her some of the more recent and more important events in the world that happened within the previous 24 hours that I will not see in any paper or even on most websites. So I start my day at 8 o'clock. She comes on live at 8 o'clock Eastern, but you could see her any time during the day. You out there in the West can just plug any time and just plug in democracynow.org, and you'll get the whole thing. Now, if you don't want to watch it, there are instant transcripts that she puts out. Well, not instant, probably 2 hours later, and you can just read things. I read quicker than I watch, but I did watch it this morning. This morning was a really good example of the excellent coverage that she gives, not only to international news events, but also to things such as what's happening in Missouri and elsewhere in our country.
And you've also been a guest on RT America. Tell people about RT. I don't know. Many Americans don't watch RT. I watch it.
Well, ironically, none other than Hillary Clinton 2 years ago said, in deploring what our Fourth Estate has become, she said, when I'm traveling, I watch Al Jazeera and RT, and I find them far better than the cable channels. She said that. Mm-hmm. Hillary Clinton.
I remember.
RT used to be called Russia Today. It's available on most, I guess, cable. I'm on it often. I never watch it except, little film clips on the web. But it is really, really a good alternative. That and Al Jazeera. Press TV is another. Now, these are looked on as being tainted. Al Jazeera because it comes out of the Middle East, RT because it is run by Russia. But I'll tell you, in terms of objectivity, RT has it hands down over CNN or Fox News or any of the other cable or network outfits that I know about. And it's not only because my friends and I get on it, but because there's a much more freewheeling discussion of what's going on in the world.
Well, we're speaking with Ray McGovern, retired CIA analyst who worked with the CIA from 1963 to 1990. And initially, I wanted you on to talk about Syria, but after I read your interview in Ex-Berliner magazine and realized that you're a Russian expert, I said, let's talk about Ukraine. So I'm going to have you back, Mr. McGovern, to talk about what's going on in the Middle East. Okay, how do you feel about that?
Be happy to. Well, happy is the wrong word. I'll be ready to do that, and I think I might be able to share some insights.
Okay, I appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. McGovern. That was Ray McGovern, who is a retired CIA analyst on the Kathleen Wells Show. He's going to be on again. This is his first time on my show. I'm going to have him on again real soon to talk about what's going on in the Middle East. Thank you, Mr. McGovern.
Most welcome.
You just listened to my interview with retired CIA analyst Ray McGovern. This interview was originally aired on KCAA, AM 1050, NBC News Talk Radio. To check out Ray's commentaries and writings, go to his website, raymcgovern.com. And be sure to check out my site where you can hear archive interviews at thekathleenwellsshow.com. That's thekathleenwellsshow.com. See you next week.
This presentation was brought to you by thekathleenwellsshow.com.